He didn't even see it satisfying. That's what stays with me. The guy was on the floor before anyone in that diner even understood what had happened. 1 second he was standing there, big as a refrigerator, hand on Bruce's collar. 4 seconds later he was looking up at the ceiling with an expression I will never forget. Like a man who had just been told something in a language he didn't speak. I was 2 booths away. I had a clear line of sight. I saw every single thing that happened. And I still don't fully understand how a man that small moved that fast. In the winter of 1969, a diner on Pico Boulevard in West Los Angeles became the setting of an incident that no newspaper covered, no television station reported, and no official record ever acknowledged. What happened inside that diner lasted approximately 4 seconds. The man who started it would never speak about it publicly. The man who finished it would never mention it at all. And the 11 people who witnessed it would carry the memory for the rest of their lives in silence. Not because they were told to be silent, but because most of them could not find the words. The diner was called Milt's. It sat on the corner of Pico and Westwood Boulevard, a flat-roofed building with wood-panelled walls, a long Formica counter, and vinyl booths the colour of dried mustard. The menu was written in white plastic letters on a brown board behind the register. Milt's opened at 6 in the morning and closed at 11 at night. It served coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during the Eisenhower administration, and pie that almost made up for it. In 1969, Milt's was not a famous restaurant. It was not a destination. It was the kind of place where people went because it was close, because the food was cheap, and because nobody bothered you. The owner was Milton Kramer, a 61-year-old Korean War veteran who had opened the diner in 1957 with money he had saved from 12 years of working road construction in the San Fernando Valley. Milt was a quiet man with thick forearms and a face that looked like it had been carved out of sandstone by someone in a hurry. He did not tolerate trouble in his diner. A hand-painted sign near the register read, in capital letters, "No fighting, no politics, no exceptions." In 12 years of operation, he had only needed to enforce that sign twice. The night of February 7th, 1969 would be the 3rd time, and the last. I've told maybe 3 people about that night. My wife, my brother, and a guy I worked with at Lockheed in the 70s, who happened to mention Bruce Lee in conversation, and I just couldn't keep it in anymore. None of them believed me. My wife thought I was exaggerating. My brother said I probably saw it wrong. The Lockheed guy just laughed. So I stopped telling people. What's the point of telling a story nobody believes? But I was sitting right there. Booth 4, 2 booths from the door. I had a plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes in front of me, and a cup of coffee that was still hot. And I saw a man who weighed at least 270 pounds try to throw Bruce Lee out of a restaurant. And I saw what happened 4 seconds after he made that mistake. Bruce Lee in February of 1969 was not the man the world would later recognize on movie posters and magazine covers. He had not yet returned to Hong Kong. He had not yet made the Big Boss or Fist of Fury. He had not yet become the most iconic martial artist in the history of the human race. In February of 1969, Bruce Lee was a 28-year-old man living in a small rented house in Bel Air with his wife Linda and their son Brandon, who had just turned 4. He was teaching martial arts privately to actors, directors, and screenwriters in Hollywood. His students included Steve McQueen, James Coburn, and Sterling Siliphant. He charged them rates that would have been considered outrageous for any other instructor. They paid without hesitation, not because Lee was famous, because after one lesson with him, every single one of them understood they were in the presence of something they had never encountered before. Lee's daily routine in that period was disciplined to the point of monastic. He woke before 6. He ran 3 miles through the hills above Bel Air before the sun had fully risen. He returned home, ate a breakfast that Linda prepared, according to a nutritional regimen he had designed himself. Proteins and vegetables, no refined sugar, no bread. Then he trained, for hours, alone. In the small backyard of their rented house, Lee had built what amounted to a private laboratory for the human body. A wooden dummy, a heavy bag filled with sand and iron filings that weighed over 300 pounds, a speed bag, a makiwara board, stacks of books on anatomy, kinesiology, boxing, fencing, and philosophy that he read between sets with a pencil in his hand, underlining passages and writing notes in the margins. He was building something, not a style, not a system, something closer to a language. He called it Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. But the name was almost irrelevant to him. The idea was what mattered, and the idea was this: do not collect techniques, do not memorize patterns, do not worship tradition. Strip everything down to what works, discard what does not, and what remains will be honest, it will be fast, and it will be yours. By early 1969, Lee was also frustrated. Hollywood had given him one significant role, Kato in The Green Hornet, and then closed its doors with the polite indifference that the industry reserved for Asian men who did not fit neatly into the roles it had already written for them. The servant, the villain, the wise old man who speaks in broken English and dies in the second act. Lee was none of these things, and Hollywood did not know what to do with a man it could not categorize. On the evening of February 7th, Bruce Lee drove to Milt's diner on Pico Boulevard. He went alone. Linda and Brandon were at home. Lee had spent the afternoon teaching a private lesson to a screenwriter in Beverly Hills, and the session had run 2 hours longer than planned. He was hungry. Milt's was on the way home. He had eaten there before, perhaps 3 or 4 times. It was not a regular spot. It was simply convenient. He parked his grey 1966 Chevy Nova on the street half a block from the entrance. He was wearing a black leather jacket over a white t-shirt, dark trousers, and leather shoes that were scuffed at the toes from footwork drills he had done that afternoon. He pushed open the door of Milt's at approximately 8:40 in the evening. The diner was half full, 11 people including staff. None of them knew that the next 20 minutes of their lives would be the 20 minutes they would remember most clearly 50 years later. Lee took a seat at the counter, not a booth. He sat on the third stool from the door, the one closest to the window. A waitress named Dolores Saucedo, who had worked at Milt's for 6 years, approached him within a minute. She would later recall that Lee ordered a cup of black coffee and a grilled chicken sandwich with no mayonnaise. She remembered because most customers at that hour ordered pie or eggs. The chicken sandwich was unusual. She also remembered that he was polite and that he thanked her twice. Once when she took the order, and once when she brought the coffee. She said he had a way of looking at you when he spoke that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. Lee sat at the counter and waited for his food. He took a small paperback from his jacket pocket and opened it to a page that had been folded at the corner. Margaret Leung, a graduate student at UCLA who was sitting in booth 6 with her roommate, noticed the book. She could not see the title from where she sat, but she noticed that the man at the counter was reading with the focus of someone studying for an exam. His coffee sat untouched for several minutes. His eyes did not leave the page. At approximately 8:55, the front door of Milt's opened and 2 men walked in. The first was of average height and build. He wore a brown corduroy jacket and glasses. He sat at the far end of the counter near the kitchen and ordered coffee. He would play no further role in what followed. The second man was not average in any respect. His name was Gerald Pittman. He was 36 years old, and he stood 6 feet 4 inches tall. He weighed approximately 270 pounds. His neck was the width of a normal man's thigh. His hands, which hung at his sides as he stood in the doorway scanning the room the way a man scans a room when he believes he is the largest thing in it, were enormous. Pittman had wrestled professionally for 11 years on the West Coast independent circuit under the name the Pacific Mauler. He had never reached the national promotions. He had never wrestled on television. He was a mid-card performer who worked small arenas in San Bernardino and Bakersfield and Fresno, towns where the crowds were loud and drunk and the ring ropes were held together with electrical tape and hope. Pittman was not famous, but in every room he entered he occupied more space than his body required. It was not just his size, it was something he carried with him, a low-frequency aggression that preceded him through doorways the way heat precedes a fire. Pittman was also, by every account that would later surface, a man with a problem. He drank, not casually, not socially. He drank the way a man drinks when he is trying to dissolve something inside himself that will not dissolve. On the night of February 7th, 1969, Gerald Pittman had been drinking since 4 in the afternoon. He had started at a bar on Venice Boulevard and moved east through 3 more establishments before arriving at Milt's. He was not there for food. He was there because Milt's was open and the last bar had asked him to leave. He walked through the front door and stood for a moment, swaying almost imperceptibly, his eyes adjusting to the fluorescent light. And then he saw Bruce Lee sitting at the counter. What happened next was witnessed by 11 people. Their accounts, gathered over decades through informal conversations, a single letter to a martial arts magazine in 1974, and 2 interviews conducted by a graduate researcher at USC in 1998, align on every significant detail. They differ only on the small things: the colour of Pittman's shirt, whether the jukebox was playing or silent, how many seconds passed between the first word and the last sound. But on the sequence of events, on what was said and what was done, 11 strangers remembered the same thing, and that is how you know something really happened. Pittman walked toward the counter. He did not walk to an empty stool. He walked directly toward Bruce Lee. His trajectory was deliberate, a straight line from the door to the 3rd stool, as if every other seat in the diner did not exist. He stopped approximately 2 feet behind Lee, close enough that Lee would have felt the heat of another body, close enough that the smell of bourbon and sweat would have reached him before the voice did. Lee did not turn around. Dolores Saucedo, who was behind the counter refilling a coffee pot, saw Pittman approach. She said her hand tightened on the pot handle before a single word was spoken. Her body knew something her mind had not yet processed. Pittman spoke first. His voice was not loud. It was low and thick, the voice of a man whose throat had been marinated in alcohol for 6 hours. "You're in my seat." Lee did not turn around. He continued looking at his book. "There are no reserved seats here," he said. His voice was calm, conversational, as if a man the size of a vending machine had not just materialized behind him. Pittman placed his hand on the counter next to Lee's coffee cup. The hand was so large it covered a section of formica the size of a dinner plate. He leaned forward, bringing his face closer to the back of Lee's head. "I said, you're in my seat, Chinese boy." The diner went quiet. Not gradually, instantly. Margaret Leung in booth 6 stopped mid-sentence. Her roommate's fork froze between the plate and her mouth. A man in booth 2 named Raymond Castillo, a postal worker who had come in for a slice of pie, set his newspaper down slowly, the way a man sets something down when he realizes he might need both hands free. Behind the counter, Dolores Saucedo took 1 step backward. Milton Kramer, who had been in the kitchen doorway wiping his hands on a towel, became very still. He called him Chinese boy. I remember that clearly because the diner went dead silent the moment he said it. You could hear the fryer in the kitchen. You could hear the clock on the wall. That's how quiet it got. And I remember thinking, this is going to be very bad. Because the big man was drunk and mean, and the little guy at the counter hadn't even turned around yet. And in my experience, when someone doesn't turn around, it means one of 2 things. Either they're scared, or they're not scared at all. And something about the way that man sat there, perfectly still, not a muscle moving, told me it wasn't the first one. Bruce Lee closed his book. He did it slowly, pressing the fold back into the corner of the page. He placed the book on the counter next to his coffee. Then he picked up his cup, took a sip, and set it down. The ceramic made a small, clean sound against the formica. He still had not turned around. Every person in that diner was watching him, and he moved as if none of them existed. Then he turned around. He did not spin. He did not jump off the stool. He rotated his upper body slowly, precisely the way a gun turret tracks a target. His feet remained on the stool's footrest. His hands remained on the counter. Only his torso and head moved, and when his eyes met Pittman's, something shifted in the room that every witness described independently, but none of them could name. Margaret Leung called it a change in temperature. Raymond Castillo said the air got heavier. Dolores Saucedo said she felt it in her stomach before she understood it in her head. Milton Kramer, who had seen combat in Korea, who had watched men die in frozen mud on the banks of the Imjin River, said it reminded him of the moment right before an artillery shell lands. The sound hasn't arrived yet. But your body already knows. Lee looked at Pittman. He did not look up at him, despite the height difference. He looked through him. His expression carried nothing. No anger, no fear, no challenge. It was the face of a man reading a sign on a wall. Neutral, utterly neutral, And that neutrality was the most terrifying thing anyone in that room had ever seen on a human face. Pittman did not read it correctly. A sober man might have. A man with experience in real violence, not performed violence, might have recognized what he was looking at. But Pittman was drunk, and Pittman had spent his entire adult life in a world where size determined hierarchy and intimidation preceded contact. In that world, the smaller man backs down. Always. It was the only physics Pittman understood. I don't think the big man knew what he was looking at. I really don't. He saw a small Chinese guy in a leather jacket sitting at a diner counter, and he thought this was going to go the way it always goes. Big guy pushes, small guy moves, story over. He had no idea. None. What was sitting on that stool was something he had never encountered and wasn't equipped to recognize. Pittman reached down and grabbed the front of Lee's leather jacket with his right hand. The grip was full-fisted, knuckles white, the grab of a man who had spent years throwing bodies into ring ropes. He pulled upward, attempting to lift Lee off the stool. "Get lost, Chinese boy, before I put you through that window." Lee came off the stool, but not because Pittman pulled him. He came off the stool the way he did everything, on his own terms, using Pittman's pull as a mechanism rather than a force. Where Pittman expected resistance or dead weight, he found neither. Lee rose with the pull, converting the upward energy into standing momentum so efficiently that Pittman's hand, which had been gripping the jacket with the intention of dragging, suddenly found itself holding nothing but loose leather as Lee's body moved inside the arc of the bigger man's arm. What happened next took 4 seconds. 4 seconds that would haunt Gerald Pittman for the rest of his life, and that 11 people in a diner on Pico Boulevard would carry with them to their graves. 4 seconds that proved what Bruce Lee had spent his entire adult life trying to articulate. That speed defeats strength. That precision defeats power. That water, given even the smallest opening, will pass through rock as if the rock were never there. Second one. Lee's left hand came up and intercepted Pittman's right wrist at the exact moment the grip on his jacket released. The interception was not a block. It was not a grab. It was a redirection. Lee's fingers wrapped around the inside of Pittman's wrist and guided the arm downward and to the right, using the bigger man's own forward momentum to pull him off axis. Pittman's upper body lurched forward. His center of gravity, which had been high and aggressive, shifted to a place where it no longer belonged to him. He stumbled half a step. His left foot crossed behind his right. For a man who had spent 11 years maintaining balance in a wrestling ring, it was the most unnatural position imaginable, and Lee had put him there with one hand and a movement that covered less than 8 inches. Second 2. Lee stepped to Pittman's left side, positioning himself at the one angle where the wrestler's size became a liability rather than an advantage. From this position, Pittman could not reach Lee with either hand without first turning his entire body, and turning required balance, and balance was something that no longer existed in Pittman's immediate future. Lee's right hand came up and struck Pittman in the solar plexus. The strike was not a punch in any conventional sense. There was no wind-up, no cocking of the shoulder, no rotation visible to the naked eye. Lee's fist travelled approximately 6 inches from a resting position at his side to the centre of Pittman's body. The sound it made was not the dramatic crack of a boxing match. It was a short, dense thud, the sound of something precise meeting something soft. Dolores Saucedo, who was closest, said it sounded like someone dropping a phone book on a leather couch. Second 3. Pittman's body folded, not dramatically, not the way men fall in movies or wrestling rings. He folded the way a building folds when the foundation is removed. His diaphragm seized. The air that had been in his lungs left through his mouth in a single involuntary exhale that sounded like a word but was not. His knees bent, his hands went to his stomach. His eyes, which had been narrow and mean 30 seconds earlier, were now wide and confused and looking at something that was not in the room. The expression on his face was not pain. Pain comes with recognition. This was something before pain. This was the body encountering an input it had no category for. Second 4. Pittman went down. His right knee hit the floor first, then his left, then his hands. He was on all fours on the floor of Milt's diner, a 270-pound professional wrestler on his hands and knees in front of a man who weighed 135 pounds less than him. His breathing was a series of short, desperate gasps. His body was trying to remember how to take in air. The diaphragm that had served him for 36 years had been temporarily disconnected from his nervous system by a strike so precise that it affected only the targeted muscle group and nothing else. Bruce Lee had hit him exactly hard enough and in exactly the right place to shut down his breathing without causing any structural damage. Not harder, not softer, exactly enough. The way a surgeon cuts, the way a locksmith turns, the way water finds the single crack in a wall that no one knew was there. Lee stood over him. His hands were at his sides. His breathing had not changed. His jacket was not disturbed. His hair was in place. 4 seconds. That is all it took. A man who had wrestled professionally for 11 years, who outweighed his opponent by 135 pounds, who had started the confrontation with every physical advantage a human body can possess, was on his hands and knees on a diner floor. And the man who put him there looked like he had just set down a cup of coffee. Nobody moved, not for what felt like a very long time. Dolores Saucedo was holding the coffee pot with both hands. Margaret Lewing had her palm pressed flat against the table. Raymond Castillo was halfway out of his booth, frozen in a position that suggested his body had started to intervene, but his mind had cancelled the order. Milton Kramer stood in the kitchen doorway with his towel still in his hand, his mouth slightly open, his eyes fixed on the 2 men in the centre of his restaurant. The only sound was Pittman breathing, short, ragged, desperate inhales that came from a body fighting to restart a system that had been shut down by a single strike. The sound filled the diner the way a heartbeat fills a hospital room, rhythmic, involuntary, the sound of biology continuing despite the instructions it had received. Lee looked down at Pittman. His expression had not changed from the moment he had turned around on the stool. That same neutrality, that same absence of performance. He was not gloating. He was not angry. He was not making a point. He was simply present, standing in a space that belonged to him in a way that the room itself seemed to acknowledge. Then Bruce Lee spoke. He said one sentence, one single sentence that every witness remembered word for word, 50 years later, without variation. "I am not a boy." His voice was quiet, not a whisper, not theatrical quiet. The quiet of a man who does not need volume because the room is already listening. 4 words that landed on the silence of that diner like stones dropped into still water. He did not say it to humiliate. He did not say it to triumph. He said it because it was true. And truth, when spoken by a man who has just demonstrated its physical proof, does not need to be loud. Pittman remained on the floor. His breathing was beginning to normalize. His arms were shaking, not from cold, from the neurological aftershock of a diaphragm resuming function after forced interruption. He did not look up. He did not speak. The man who had walked into Milt's diner 15 minutes earlier, believing he was the most dangerous person in any room he entered, could not raise his head to look at the man standing above him. Lee turned back to the counter. He sat down on the same stool, third from the door. He picked up his coffee cup and took another sip. Dolores Saucedo, operating on the autopilot of a woman who had served customers through earthquakes and bar fights and 3 armed robberies in 6 years, walked over and refilled his cup without being asked. Her hands were shaking. The coffee pot rattled against the rim of the cup. She would later say that Lee looked at her and gave her a small nod. Not a smile, a nod. The kind of acknowledgement that exists between 2 people when words are insufficient, and both of them know it. Lee picked up his book. He opened it to the same folded page. He resumed reading. Behind him, Gerald Pittman slowly pushed himself to his feet. Pittman stood for a moment swaying. His right hand was pressed against his stomach. His left hand gripped the edge of the counter for balance. He did not look at Lee. He did not look at anyone. He turned and walked toward the door with the careful, deliberate steps of a man navigating a floor that had become unreliable. He pushed the door open with his shoulder because his hands were otherwise occupied, one holding his stomach, the other hanging at his side as if it had forgotten its purpose. The door swung shut behind him. Through the window, Dolores Salcedo watched him walk to a brown pickup truck parked across the street. He sat in the driver's seat for what she estimated was 10 minutes before starting the engine and pulling away. He never came back to Milt's. The diner remained quiet for a long time after Pittman left. Not silent, quiet. The difference is important. Silence is the absence of sound. Quiet is the presence of people choosing not to make any. Forks resumed, coffee was sipped. The conversation restarted in booth 6 at a volume that was noticeably lower than before. The clock on the wall read 9:07. The entire incident, from Pittman's first word to his exit through the front door, had lasted less than 4 minutes. Milt and Kramer walked from the kitchen doorway to the counter. He stopped near Lee, but not directly in front of him. He stood there for a moment, towel over his shoulder, looking at the man who had just resolved a situation that his hand-painted sign had failed to prevent. According to Dolores, Milt reached under the counter and pulled out a slice of apple pie on a white plate. He set it down next to Lee's coffee without a word. Lee looked at the pie, then he looked at Kramer. Then he gave the same small nod he had given Dolores. Kramer returned to the kitchen. The pie was never charged to anyone's bill. Bruce Lee finished his coffee. He ate the pie. He read 11 more pages of his book. Then he placed money on the counter, put on his jacket, and walked out of Milt's diner into the February night. Dolores Salcedo counted the bills after he left. He had tipped 40%. Gerald Pittman retired from professional wrestling in 1971. He moved to a small town in northern Oregon and took a job at a lumber mill. He never returned to the ring. He never spoke publicly about the incident at Milt's diner. A nephew, interviewed in 2003 by a martial arts forum moderator conducting informal research, said that his uncle had mentioned it once at a family gathering in 1984. According to the nephew, Pittman said, "Only this. I grabbed the wrong man once. Just once, and he taught me everything I needed to know in 4 seconds." The nephew asked who the man was. Pittman shook his head. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Milt's diner closed in 1987 when Milt and Kramer retired at the age of 79. The building was demolished in 1992 to make way for a parking structure. Nothing marks the spot where it stood. No plaque, no sign. Just concrete and painted lines and cars that come and go without knowing what happened on the floor beneath them on a cold night in February more than half a century ago. Bruce Lee left for Hong Kong in 1971. Within 2 years, he would become the most famous martial artist who ever lived. And on July 20th, 1973, at the age of 32, he would die. He never spoke about what happened at Milt's diner. Not to Linda, not to his students, not in any interview or letter or journal entry that has ever been found. It occupied no space in his public life. Because for Bruce Lee, what happened that night was not a story. It was a Tuesday. And water does not remember the stones it passes over. It simply moves. It shapes what it touches. And then it is gone. I've told maybe 3 people about that night. My wife, my brother, and a guy from Lockheed. None of them believed me. So I stopped telling people, but I was there. Booth 4. 2 booths from the door. Meatloaf and mashed potatoes. Coffee still hot. I saw everything, and 50 years later, I still don't have the words for what I saw. I just know that a very big man grabbed a very small man. And 4 seconds later, the big man was on the floor. And the small man sat back down and finished his coffee. Like nothing had happened. Like nothing ever could.